Okay, I came across something interesting that I wanted to show you. This is a roadmap for India to get onto a path of becoming a developed nation. It was presented just a few years after independence in 1956. And if we would have done whatever was written in this roadmap, there's a good chance that you and I would be living in a much richer country today. Like the dream of a better life that leads so many Indians to move abroad.
आपको मैं दिखाती हूँ अमेरिका में क्या होता है कि अगर बस आई हुई है तो कोई भी ओवरटेक बस को नहीं करेंगे।
अमेरिका का हर एक गांव इंडिया के दिल्ली और मुंबई से भी ज्यादा डेवलप है।
कोई गड्ढे वड्ढे नहीं दिख रहे और पानी हर जगह पे ऐसे ड्रेनेज सिस्टम बना हुआ है। गुरु, when you went to India, did you see the drainage system like the same way?
All of that likely could have been built right here, possibly if we follow this roadmap. This whole roadmap was designed to answer one question. How do you make a poor country rich?
But the national flag, saffron, white and green tricolour, was publicly unfurled for the birth of the Dominion of India.
Back then, after independence, India had barely any money left.
The amount of money that the British looted from India, $45 trillion, is 17 times the current GDP of the UK, 17.
India was back then a poor, agrarian, newly independent country that was trying to stabilize itself. So the first 5 years of governance, they were spent mainly on repair and survival, focusing on things like irrigation, on food production. But then to bring the country out of poverty, we had to plan something different. And this roadmap became a part of that plan. And it concluded that India should invest heavily in capital goods, things like machines and industrial equipment that can help the country produce other goods. Most large economies that you see now, they did that when they were poor as well. Economists actually call it structural transformation, where a country becomes rich when workers move from farm and agriculture work to factory work and then eventually into services. But if you look at India today, something clearly did not go according to plan, because nearly half of the Indians today still depend on agriculture for their livelihood. Instead of following the path of farms to manufacturing and then services, we largely just skipped the middle part and jumped straight into becoming a service-led economy. But this decision of missing manufacturing, it's taking a toll on us now. The rupee still keeps weakening, we still rely heavily on imports, and despite all the talk of becoming the world's factory, we still continue to buy far more than we are able to make. And all of this is affecting you and me, because even though India is soon to become a $5 trillion economy and it is one of the fastest growing major economies in the world, for a lot of people, the life they live still feels very different. Basic transportation, fuel, roads, all of it in our country feels like the average man is being cheated. What choices did we make back then, and how did those choices lead us here? Because if we still don't understand how we got here, how will we ever know where we are heading? Okay, before we move on, I want to share some BTS on how I write scripts like this and one change I've made recently in the way I work. I'm trying to type lesser. See, a lot of the times, the idea for a script is already clear in my head. The slow part is getting it onto the screen. And that is where today's sponsor, Whisperflow, comes in. Whisperflow is a speech-to-text tool that lets you write by speaking. Instead of manually typing out every line, I can just talk naturally and it instantly turns my speech into polished text. This is especially helpful for video scripts because when I type a script, it can sound too formal. But when I speak it first, instead of going from a agriculture economy to manufacturing and then services, we just skip the middle layer altogether. The writing sounds more like me. It matches the way I actually talk in person. And another thing I really like is that it doesn't feel like a separate productivity app that I have to open and manage. It works across apps and platforms, so I can use it wherever I'm already writing. That includes notes, emails, messages, docs, scripts, and even search bars. And even if I have to correct myself or rephrase a thought while speaking, Whisperflow understands what I mean and it gives me that final version as text. So instead of just ending up with a messy transcript, I get a draft I can actually use. And another really underrated thing is their focus on privacy. Your voice data is sensitive information, but on Whisperflow, you can just turn on privacy mode and it will not store any dictation data or use it to train AI models. You can protect your voice and your privacy completely. So if you spend a lot of your day writing emails, messages, notes, scripts, prompts, or ideas, Whisperflow is basically your voice becoming your keyboard. I'll leave the link in the description in case you want to try it out. Now back to the video. Okay, before getting into how India's economy really shaped itself, I want to start with something that we all can see today.
कि साल भर तक हम सोने के गहने नहीं खरीदेंगे, सोना नहीं खरीदेंगे।
So, why would a prime minister ask the country to hold on from buying gold when the economy is seemingly doing good and doing good enough to be called the fastest growing major economy? Okay, let's look at the second part of this question first, the fastest growing major economy part. The reason we're called that so is because our GDP growth has stayed around 7%, and that's well above most other large economies. But I want to look into these macroeconomic indicators. One of the good ways to tell that the country is doing well is by looking at how much women participation is there in the workforce. More women working is usually a good sign that people in general have better access to education, to jobs, and to opportunities, and that the economy is making a better use of its workforce. Now, obviously, you should look at it along with other indicators to get the full picture. But for now, let's try to focus on this one only. According to the labor force participation rate, these numbers look encouraging. More women are participating in the labor force than a few years ago. But when you start to dig deeper, you'll start to see that much of that increase comes from rural or informal work, not from our formal sector, and it's important to give that a thought. Someone who's working in a farm or doing a delivery job could be working day and night, but they will be producing way less value economically than someone who's working only limited hours but employed in a formal sector. And that is because it has to do something with productivity than just being counted as employed. In fact, if you look at the way employment is assessed in India, you are counted as unemployed only and only if you did not work even a single hour during the entire week that you were surveyed, which also means that if you work just 1 hour in a week, you are counted as employed. And if employed under this definition for 30 days, a person is considered employed for the entire year. So all of this artificially lowers the unemployment rate and it creates a disconnect. And this happens with other macroeconomic indicators as well, like GDP, like inflation and purchasing power. So even though the country might be suffering from within, the economic indicators will tell you otherwise. And economists have been highlighting that India does not have a single economy. Every number of those indicators, they will change if you focus on different class groups. And every one of those economies will move at a different speed. But then, how do you really tell if a country's economy is doing well? Well, in India's case, currency is one such way to do it. Again, this is not the most accurate way to judge an economy, and to understand it properly, you have to look at multiple indicators together. But in India's case, it does tell us something important, like whether the world trusts the country, whether it needs what we are producing, and whether our institutions will seem stable, and whether our economy is earning enough foreign exchange. The reason I said India's case is because some countries deliberately keep their currency weaker because it can help make their exports cheaper and more competitive. But India's problem is different. India is not yet a major export powerhouse in goods. We export strong IT and business services, and we still import a lot of essential things. Things such as oil, gold, electronics, and industrial materials. That's why the Prime Minister is asking us to buy less gold, because every time India imports gold, we need dollars to pay for it. And if the dollar was 80 rupees yesterday and 95 rupees today, then we are paying extra 15 rupees to import the same amount of gold. Now, we need to be importing all of this because India largely skipped the manufacturing and industrialization stage and it went straight into services. But my question is, why? Why did we do that? What were we doing as a country in the 70s and 80s when neighboring countries like China were scaling up their industrial power? And now, is there any way to recover from that past damage? Okay, so there's this concept in macroeconomics called the Lewis turning point. In a poor agrarian economy, there are usually too many people that are dependent on farming, so wages will stay low because labor is easily available and productivity is also low. Now, for that country to grow, it first has to move their surplus workers out of farms and into factories. That only happens with industrialization, where factories can start pulling workers out of agriculture. Now, for a while, this works well because industries get cheap labor, their production expands, and the economy starts to grow. But after enough workers move out, agriculture no longer has unlimited labor left. And when this happens, it's called the Lewis turning point, because after this point, when not enough labor is left, wages begin to rise, both in farms and factories. So people naturally have more wages, more to spend, and thus increasing the economy. And the growth begins to come from higher value production work with better skills, machines, and technology instead of cheap labor, because the country has run out of that cheap labor. Now, this happened with Japan in 1960, South Korea in the mid-60s, and for China, it was said to be around 2010. But India is nowhere close to that. Agriculture today still contributes to 1/5 of our country's economy. Nearly 80% of our workforce is still in the informal sector, waiting to move into more productive industrial and formal jobs. But why is that? Why did it not happen for our country? Well, if you look at other countries and see how they did it, a lot of their success depends upon the government and the policies that the government formed to support industrialization. Take China, for example. This is Shenzhen, which is a global metropolis that is wealthy, futuristic, and technologically advanced. But about 40 years ago, it looked like this. It was just a poor village with the only advantage of cheap labor and location. But the reason it turned into something like this is because of what the Chinese government did after 1978. During this time, the Chinese government decided to gradually open up parts of the economy to the world. So they created these special economic zones at the coastal areas for foreign businesses to come and set up there. But in order to build the city from nothing, it used an investment-led growth model. One of the things it did was it incentivized local governments to build roads, to get water, housing, electricity, and all the basic infrastructure so that it could support settlement and trade. Basically, the state is the one that created the conditions in the first place so that businesses could become productive. But it's not like India didn't plan anything. After 1956, our governments had similar plans to build the country's economy. But unlike countries like China, Japan, and South Korea, Indian leaders were not convinced to bet on foreign trade back then. It was mostly because since we just came out of a colonial rule, they feared becoming dependent on foreign trade. And on the other hand, even though the private sector existed, it did not have enough capital, technology, or scale to build those industries up quickly. To begin industrialization, the state brought in public sector units or PSUs.
There was a euphoric assertion that the public sector units would now occupy the commanding heights of India's economy.
Now, PSUs were imagined as the institutions that would build India's industrial base. It is owned fully or mostly by the government, and in Nehru's world, it was meant to socialize profits.
Through the public sector, his dream was to socialize profits. Socializing profit means you kill two birds with one stone. Profits are the biggest source of further investment. By socializing profits, therefore, you increase the rate of investment and capital accumulation.
By 1961, India had 47 public sector enterprises with a total investment of around 948 crores. Now, even though everything was thought of well and in good faith, it still didn't work out for two big reasons. In the 60s, India went through wars, droughts, food shortages, inflation, and political instability. So it never got the environment that this plan needed because the country was busy dealing with one crisis after another. Now, even if those crises had not happened, there was another problem.
The British Raj was gone. Now people were subjected to the permit Raj because everything needed a government permit.
The government of India went into business in a big way, and they decided to control whatever was there in the private sector also as firmly and fiercely as they could.
Now, when the government brought in public sector units, it didn't say that they will just build these industries. It also meant that they will be the one deciding what to build and how much of it to build. Imports were tightly controlled, industries needed licenses to expand, and domestic firms were largely protected from foreign competition. So PSUs ended up becoming protected monopolies. If a company does not face real competition, it has lesser pressure to reduce its costs or to improve its quality, to innovate, or to treat its customers well. Now, this became the beginning of the License Raj era. Imagine you want to make cars. People are waiting to buy them. But you cannot increase production unless the government allows you to. You cannot easily import better parts or get foreign technology or raise your capacity of production freely. So instead of competing by building a better product, you end up competing for licenses and the right connections. And over time, that changed the incentive itself. Making a better product started mattering lesser than actually getting the government permission, which corrupted the entire system. And this era went on like this for 2 decades until
Crisis, therefore, is also an opportunity. And I am going to use this crisis to begin a process of structural change.
It's 1991 and India has just liberalized its economy. The country finally decided to open up to foreign investment coming in. The services sector was beginning to now take off. Indian businesses were entering a new era. And despite skipping the whole manufacturing stage, it felt like India had another chance to become a developed nation. Telecom, finance, consumer goods, and IT became India's biggest success stories. But this is also where the story started to split. The services boom created enormous opportunities, but mostly for people who already had education and access to cities, whereas a much larger part of India was left behind in agriculture and informal work without the access of education or opportunities. Now, if you compare this with East Asian countries, the way markets were forming there was completely different. Economists call it the flying geese model. The basic idea of that model is that the leading country will pass its older industries down to developing nations as it adopts newer technologies. So Japan was the lead goose, and as the lead goose, it led the way, moving from textiles into steels, cars, and then electronics. The industries Japan left behind gradually shifted to South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and later China. In simple terms, they built a ladder. But India did not fully fit into this ladder. We never specialized in the kind of labor-intensive manufacturing that countries across East Asia were exporting to the world. Instead, our biggest global success became services. And that created tremendous value, but it couldn't absorb millions of workers the way manufacturing could. And that is one of the reasons we still import so many of the things that other countries have learned to make themselves. And this is why India is now pushing manufacturing so aggressively with schemes like Production-Linked Incentive Schemes, or PLIs, which is basically a government's initiative that extends to 14 different sectors, and it provides financial rewards to companies for increasing their manufacturing output and producing more of it in India. The hope is that India can use this small window to become a China plus one, bringing global companies here to create factory jobs, to reduce imports, and to build supplier networks. But economists believe that these schemes have their own issues, because these schemes reward companies for making products in India, but it doesn't necessarily reward them for making the parts that go inside these products, which means that there's a real possibility that India just ends up becoming an assembly hub instead of a manufacturing powerhouse. And in many sectors, companies primarily import finished or semi-finished components, and then they simply assemble them locally, which leads to low value addition rather than deep domestic manufacturing capabilities. But say, even if these schemes did help, even if we are able to become an alternative to China, there is still an aspect of the economy that we have been ignoring for decades, that without it, nothing would really work. I don't know if you've noticed yet, but you can see that there are pillars that shape the country's economy. And if we don't understand what they are and what they should do, we will miss out on understanding what policies do we really need for the country to grow and for it to become developed. The first and the most prominent pillar, which basically directs everything, is the state, basically the government. The government is responsible for maintaining order, for protecting rights, for building infrastructure, and you could see how the government plays its role in things like China's special economic zones or for India's public sector units. The second pillar is the markets, which is the world of businesses, of workers, of consumers, of trade, and of competition. You could sense that the participation in the flying geese model or in India's service sector growth. But there is another pillar, probably the most crucial one, the one every developed nation has been focusing on, but we as a country have been ignoring it for decades, and the sad part is that we still do. The community, the people. By community, I just don't mean culture or religion. I mean the people and systems that you are born into. The things that quietly shape the opportunities that you have long before the market ever does. And if I could show you what it looks like, let me take you to South Korea. After the Korean War, South Korea was not some ready-made industrial machine. It was just like India, relatively poor, damaged, and still deeply rural. But one thing the country did very early was treat education almost like national infrastructure and not as like a welfare extra. By 1960, literacy in the country had reached about 70%, up from 22% in 1945. The World Bank noted Korea's education levels at that time were already comparable to countries with 2 to 3 times its income level. That matters because when Korea's export push began in the 60s, factories were not pulling in a completely unprepared population. A young person coming from a village could read instructions, they could learn factory discipline, they could operate machines, and they could move into technical training and slowly climb the ladder into better work. This is the community pillar in a very practical sense. And it's not just about education. South Korea also pushed its villages rather than abandoning them through a program called Simol Undong, where villagers were participating in the work themselves to improve roads, sanitation, farming methods, and build local income. Women were also pulled into this process. It created a society where industrialization had a broader base. People call this geographical luck, but it's really just how these pillars shape the country, especially the state, the government, since it controls everything. And that is where India's challenge becomes much bigger than economics, because India cannot just copy China or South Korea or any other country for that matter. Neither can we keep assuming that GDP growth will somehow pull everybody in the country up. India's problem is more specific. We have the people. In fact, we have one of the largest young populations in the world, but we still don't have enough productive work for that population. A huge share of our workforce is still dependent on agriculture, on gig work, and on low productivity jobs. And this population cannot do much because they're barely surviving to live another day. What people need are industries that can absorb this population into jobs. They need schools and colleges that can provide them skills that those industries demand. And that is why the state, the market, and the community, they all have to move together. It's the responsibility of the state to build the foundation, the responsibility of the markets to turn that foundation into jobs and industries, and the responsibility of the community to use the opportunities that are created for them. If one of them fails, the whole system stays incomplete. And that's exactly what India has struggled with. This huge population that we have, it has become a burden rather than the advantage which it could have become. If only people were educated, skilled, healthy, and were able to do productive work. And that is why we also have to keenly observe what promises our government is making, what is being accomplished, and for what reason. Because while states can go on getting credits for offering freebies or reservation, it is still not real development. It's just vote bank politics. So for the final question, will India finally be developed by 2047? Yes, probably. But if it still goes on the way we have been going for the last 70 years, then we might become one of the largest economies in the world, yet still feel like a country where it is too difficult for the people to live in.